for coming. I'm here with the Attorney General from the ACT, New South Wales and South Australia, and of course we've just finished discussing the introduction of an R18 classification in this country. I'm happy to indicate that there is an in-principle agreement to introduce an R18 classification. 8 jurisdictions did agree in principle, and New South Wales, who of course the Attorney's here and can clearly speak for himself on this matter, but has abstained on at this point. It's the most recent government, and indeed it's the first attendance by the New South Wales Attorney, and indeed the New South Wales government was unadvised to consider the matter out of session. I just wanted to make some comments about this matter that's been on this agenda for nearly a decade. This is very important reform as far as the Commonwealth is concerned. We wanted to ensure that we had an R18 classification so that we caught up with the rest of the world and at the same time ensured that we had sufficient protection in place for children in this country. We've had a situation where too many games have been in the MA category as far as the Commonwealth was concerned, and we believe that this introduction, once it's to happen, will allow for the games that are adult themed to be suitably classified for that R18 classification. So it is an in-principle agreement. There were some amendments that were considered by the Attorneys General today, and those amendments will have to be considered by respective cabinets. But I am very pleased with the overwhelming support from the attorneys today. I thank them for their efforts. I thank the attorneys for the goodwill that the discussions have exhibited in compromising so we could reach what I think is an historic agreement, and I understand of course New South Wales is in a position to consider this matter out of session, but I do believe that the criticism that the Council of Attorneys General doesn't always make decisions can be put to rest today. This matter has been, as I say, ongoing, but we have today struck an historic agreement, and for that reason I applaud the efforts of my colleagues, and I'll I guess invite them now to make some comments on these issues. If there are other questions to me specifically on other matters of a federal nature, I'm happy to take them at the end of this particular issue, and I imagine the attorneys can do the same on other matters that might be specific to their jurisdictions. But if you could keep your questions on this particular issue until we exhaust it, thank you.
Can I just get you to swap the mic over, please? Sorry.
Do we want to perhaps ask a couple of questions of Minister O'Connor first?
Sure.
That might be the easier way rather than shuffling around. Minister, first of all, what's the next step from here, given that there's not agreement from New South Wales? Is it legislated at a Commonwealth level? How will it actually be
what we needed, of course, is an agreement reached. New South Wales abstained today. There is an in-principle agreement in place that allows for the introduction of an R18 classification, but with classification levels, jurisdictions can determine whether in fact they apply them in their jurisdiction, and in that regard we have an X-rated classification that was introduced many years ago but only applies in 2 states. So I'd hope to think that we will have R18 classification for video games across the country, but it's entirely up to the New South Wales how they would apply that issue. But I'm confident now that with the in-principle agreement at the Attorneys General meeting today, we'll be able to move forward and strike an agreement and indeed ensure that we implement R18 classification in Australia, and that's an historic moment for this Council.
So the end result could be not a nationally consistent system?
Well, as I say, there are already some exceptions to the consistency. As we've seen, we have the ACT and the Northern Territory have a separate classification for film, for example. So there are some of those changes, but I have to make it very clear. We came to this discussion in good faith. We've entered into dialogue with the jurisdictions. We've seen some compromise today. We now have in place draft guidelines that I believe protect the interests of children, also provide better parental guidance, and at the same time ensure that adults get to engage with adult-themed games. The average age of a gamer in Australia is 30. I think that has to be recognised, and at the same time we've had too many games in the MA classification that are played only by adults lawfully overseas. That will change with the introduction of the R18 classification.
The South Australian government was pushing for the MA15 rating should be scrapped altogether. Was there discussion of that, and what?
Well, I'm happy for the Attorney General of South Australia to answer that question. But again, as I say, jurisdictions have a capacity to do certain things to the national classification scheme, as we already see with an X-rated classification in 2 jurisdictions. But we needed to get consensus around the introduction of an R18 classification. Today, eight jurisdictions voted in favour of an in-principle agreement, and 1 jurisdiction abstained. And I think there's good reasons why they're in a position to consider abstaining, given their recent, the first attendance of the New South Wales General at this.
Sorry, bud.
You just asked me to stop because of the helicopter, or you
I was going to ask another question. Going to butt in, sorry.
Oh, well, you're going to butt in. Well, I'm just saying this is I understand why the New South Wales Attorney was in a position to do what he did today, but this in-principle agreement will allow us to go forward with a classification for adults in this country.
And just on another topic, the Malaysia deal looks like it might be signed by Monday. Do you have any reaction to that? Is this the right time frame? Do you have?
There are any other questions on R18. I'm happy to come to those matters after.
Best case scenario is perhaps better for Attorney General here in South Australia. The best case scenario, where would you like to see these classifications in place around the country?
Well, I don't want this matter returning to another attorneys meeting under this forum. These matters now can be dealt with out of session. I'm confident now that we have an in-principle agreement, and we'll be able to move forward with the introduction of R18 classification when the cabinets of these jurisdictions have signed off on the amendments that were made today. And you have to understand, because there were amendments at the 11th hour to the guidelines, it's perfectly proper that those jurisdictions consider those amendments, but the attorneys that were in support of this proposition today indeed need to take those matters back, but they were certainly supporting the proposition. So I believe that it's a matter of months that we'll see the capacity for us to introduce or start to introduce this classification. There are some mechanics to that as well, of course, and we'll have to deal with those. And also it'll then allow the reclassification of some games pursuant to the new guidelines, which will mean we'll be able to take games that are currently played by children and place them into an adult classification, which again, as I say, is in the interest of families in this country and in the interest of parental guidance.
Won't this agreement result in a patchy system if it's not actually consistent?
I just said to you earlier that there's already exceptions to the national classification scheme, and jurisdictions have the right, as is proper, to determine what they do with respect to the national classification scheme. I hope, of course, I like to see consistency on classifications, and I like to see, I'm sure we all do, like to see the 9 jurisdictions agreeing on these classifications. But there is a level of autonomy within jurisdictions, and they have a right to determine some variations in the national scheme. I encourage.
Override the state.
Well, let's just reflect on today's effort. Today we have 9 governments in the room, and we have had an in-principle agreement by 8 and 1 abstaining for good reason, I think. And I think we've now struck an historic agreement, and we can move forward at having an adult classification scheme in this country, like is the case in New Zealand, in the United States, United Kingdom, Europe and other parts of the world. This is an important step forward for our classification scheme, and I'm very happy with the efforts of the Attorneys General today for coming together and reaching agreement on this matter.
What about the other issues such as privacy concerns for Facebook and letting parents access Facebook, and also suppression?
Look, can I just, if I'm not meant to not answer questions, but can I just, if there are any other questions to me or to other of my colleagues here in relation to the R18,
just on that R18 rating, is there a sense where the technology is going to overtake the law anyway? We're seeing music, people now purchasing most of their music online. We're seeing bookstores shut down because they're being bought online, and indeed gaming is fast moving online into a world which is beyond government's regulation.
Well, that's one of the reasons. This is another reason why we need an R18 classification, because there will still be, and I've said this before, but there will still be, and there still should be, a refused classification preventing and prohibiting certain material, whether it be film or whether it be games. There is certain material that should not be accessed lawfully in this country. Child pornography is clearly the most obvious example of things that should be prohibited. And by having an R18 classification, it will be easier. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it will be easier for us to manage the flow of information that's coming in through the internet. And I speak often with Minister Conroy on these matters, and one of the ways he can provide a very qualified way of preventing certain information is to have a more effective classification scheme, and that's why we need to limit that prohibition to refuse classification, and I do believe again this introduction will allow for a more effective way of doing that.
For gamers, will it mean that they'll be able to get some access to for games that perhaps they couldn't have accessed before because we've got this new R18 plus scheme?
Well, as I've said before, that this is not about pushing refused classification games into an R18 classification. We do believe adults should be able to access adult games, but we've ensured that the definitions allow for a new classification. We've not changed the definition in any way that would affect the refused classification, and we have now a confined MA classification which will lift games into the R18
so practically it's more about limiting children's access to games that shouldn't have been playing in the first place. I think that provided that it's not offending the refused classification, I think that of course games that are in R18 are fine, but we have not altered the refused classification definition, and the only way some of those things could happen is if we abolished or altered in some significant way the refused classification definition.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the New South Wales Government, I am delighted that agreement has been reached in principle about this very difficult issue that's taken many years to sort out. We are new in our government. I have to get back and sound a public reaction to the agreement and before I take it to Cabinet. But I'm sure there will be discussions between us and the Commonwealth concerning the new guidelines that have been amended today, which all the cabinets will be looking at, and I don't expect that in the ultimate New South Wales will be run out.
How soon do you think you'll be able to make a final decision?
Well, we've got to consult for a while on these things. I mean, the amendments were quite considerable in part, dealing with violence and matters of that sort, and sexual violence. The need to protect children and women from exploitation are matters of consideration. I don't think it'll take all that long, but I wouldn't like to put a time on it.
But you don't envisage that your state will be the fly in the ointment, if you like, for the national scheme?
I'm sure that we take reasonable approaches to most things. I'm sure that there will be a reasonable compromise established so that the nation will move forward. I'm particularly pleased with the Minister's assurance that unsuitable MA15 plus videos are likely to be removed and reclassified as R18 plus. So that's basically all I have to say.
Was there any discussion coming into this meeting? Obviously you knew what the agenda was. Was there any discussion amongst your government about what your position may be?
We had some discussion, but we have been concentrating on the first 100 days. We had a magnificent victory in March. I'm afraid that though matters that were in that first 100-day program dominated, but we did have discussions about it and we studied the matters. But there were some significant changes today in the guidelines, and I'm happy to take those back.
What are your thoughts about the current, some of the games out there, some of the violent and sexually explicit games?
The ones under MA15 plus, I think some of them are undesirable for younger people. I think they're more in the adult category, and I'm heartened by the thoughts of that being moved into the adult category.
So does that indicate that you're more likely to err towards?
I don't want to speculate, but I've said what I've said, and you should be able to draw reasonable inferences from that.
The Christian lobby is opposed to the R18 rating, so are you expecting a backlash from them?
Well, look, I don't know whether there'll be a backlash. When you say that, I understand the Catholic bishops support the R18 plus rating, so there is a mixture of views in those religious groups. We take our decisions based on best public policy.
Well, Attorney, what is South Australia's position now out of this? I know you were pushing for the MA15 rating to be scrapped. Have you had any success on that front?
Well, I'm actually delighted with the outcome today. We did favour a restricted category being introduced, and that appears to be the agreement that's been arrived at today. The rest of the classifications will include slightly rebadged, if you like, MA15 plus classifications. Our view is that we're completely comfortable with the decision that's being made today, because in South Australia, as I've indicated many times, our view is to fold the MA15 plus into the R18 classification when it comes in, so that in effect an extra sticker goes on top of the box. Where it says MA15, there will be an R18 sticker put over that MA15 in South Australia. So I'm entirely relaxed with the decisions. I support the classifications. We will have those marketed in South Australia with that slight variation, but all of the games that are accessible in other states will be accessible here.
Is it disappointing that you've been rebuffed by perhaps the other state attorney generals for the same scheme to be national?
No, not at all. In fact, I think the discussion that's gone on here has always been on the basis that there's two steps. The first step is having a classification scheme which has different elements in it. The big change today is we are now going to have an R18 element in it. I've supported that all along. And which way each of the states agreed to use those already classified games in their own jurisdictions is a matter for them. And we've made a decision about that. I'm also very comfortable and happy about that.
Will you push ahead immediately, or will you wait for any sort of outcome of the New South Wales decision?
No, look, obviously we are going to wait for the Commonwealth to be in a position to actually do the reclassification and make the necessary changes to the law at a Commonwealth level. But as soon as R18 classified games start flowing into the system, they will be available in South Australia. And as I've said many times before, this government's view about the MA15 classification, even though it has now been, from my point of view, improved because it's made it a little tighter than it was, that classification will be given the same stamp. But those games will be available here just like they are in every other part of the Commonwealth.
Is it fair to say that South Australia has wound up with this one-out position, compromise position, because of the opinions of your predecessor, the stance he took against an R18?
No, look, I think it's fair to say my predecessor had a view about the R18 classification, not the MA15. So it's got nothing to do with that. What it's got to do with is very simple. Parents in South Australia are going to have three simple choices for their children: G, PG or M. The rest of the games, which will include what in other states might be MA or R, will be available to adults. That's a very simple rule, and it will give more information to parents. That's what we're doing.
What this will effectively mean for young gamers is that they won't be able to access things that they were perhaps accessing before. Is that more or less the crux of it? Anyone 15 and over will not be able to get some of these more explicit games?
That is correct, but even in the other states, I need to point out, because of the new guidelines, some of the games that are now MA15 plus around Australia will be reclassified to be R18. So that would be happening to some degree in any event.